All right, we're ready to start. Good evening, everyone. My name is Kirill Repin. I'm working at the European University Viadrina in Frankfurt, Oder. And together with my colleague Stefan Henkel, whom you can also see on the screen, we've been organizing the summer school Viadrinicum, which is a transsectoral summer school taking place every year here in the German-Polish borderland. This year, it is a child of cooperation between the European University Viadrina Center for East European and International Studies in Berlin and Brandenburg State Museum of Modern Art, located both in Cottbus and Frankfurt Oder. Entitled as a Transsectoral Lab on Post-Migration, Disintegrative Encounters. This year, the school invited around 30 participants from 14 countries, primarily the countries of Eastern Partnership, Russia, Germany, and Poland, representing different academic disciplines, but also different fields of action, civil society, the field of the arts, to debate together the issues of migration, diversity, and also deliberate to which extent the perspective of post-migration is applicable in the context of Central and Eastern Europe and beyond that. Initially, this event was planned to be taking place at the Center for East European and International Studies in Berlin as a part of our visit to this institution, but due to the well-known circumstances, it was shifted online. And we're really grateful to ZOiS for this virtual hospitality, and especially to Gwendolyn and Sasse, who was kind enough to take up the task of moderating our today's event. And before I give the word over to Gwendolyn, I wanted to mention the rough plan for our today's evening. The discussion will start with opening statements of our three panelists. Afterwards, there will be a discussion between them, and then later on in the third part of the event, the floor will be open also to your questions, which you're welcome to ask either in person by turning on your camera and raising your hand, or you're also welcome to write your comments and questions in chat, both here in Zoom and on Facebook, where we should also be having a stream of our tonight's discussion. And at this point, I would like to withdraw myself to the background and leave the floor to our delighted guests today.
Thank you very much, Kirill. Thank you also for the warm welcome. I think it's the first time I heard the term virtual hospitality, so I'm glad such a thing exists. So yes, welcome in this format. And I'm very happy as the director of ZOiS, the Center for East European and International Studies, to be involved in this event this evening. The title of our discussion, I think, is an intriguing one. It is called "The Normal to Return to?" I think that question mark will be quite important in our discussion, learning from or the learning migration in times of a pandemic. And I'm being joined by three great panelists. I will introduce them briefly. From Kazakhstan, we are being joined by Altynay Kambekova. She's an independent researcher and a member of the Kazakhstan feminist initiative, Feminita. This is a grassroots initiative that promotes the rights of lesbian, bisexual, queer, and trans women in Kazakhstan. She holds an MA in Nationalism Studies from the CEU, the Central European University, and her research interests are located at the intersection of gender, sexuality, and nationalism. From Kiev, we are being joined by Maksym Butkevych, a human rights activist and the coordinator of the No Borders project. This is a non-governmental initiative, and as part of that project, he deals with the issues concerning the right to asylum and refugee assistance in Ukraine. He holds, I think, 2 MA degrees, one in social philosophy and one in anthropology of development, one from Taras Shevchenko Kiev National University and one from the University of Sussex. So welcome to the panel as well. And last but not least, we're glad to have on board Dr. Stella Schindel. She is a member of the Department of Cultural Studies at the European University Viadrina. She's also the academic coordinator of the Viadrina Institute for European Studies. and she works in her research on issues related to the EU border regimes and biopolitics, among other issues. So also very relevant to our discussion this evening. So if we return to the title of this discussion, I think we can immediately sort of enter the discussion by thinking about some of the broad lines of the concepts of the state, of citizenship, of mobility, all of which have come to the fore again, or maybe more so during the pandemic. And while COVID-19 is a truly global phenomenon, it has also brought out the tendencies that underpin nation states, control mechanisms of the nation state, and central state capacities have been very important. There has also been expectations of societies directed at the state in particular. We've also heard the rhetoric that we are all in this together, often in different contexts, but we also see, if we look closely, that it brings to our attention, or should bring to our attention, all kinds of inequalities that we will discuss, either get caused by a pandemic or maybe are reinforced. And we will have time to discuss all of these issues, conceptual and empirical issues, comparatively, and with a focus on particular locations, in particular Kazakhstan and Ukraine. So without further ado, let's get going. And I hand over to Altynay. Each of you has a maximum of 8 minutes for kind of some opening remarks, and then we'll move on to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Gwendolyn, for introduction, and thank you, the team, for invitation and organization of such an interesting panel discussion. As it was mentioned before, one of my primary research interests are the intersections of nationalism and the body itself, the gender, and embodied experiences. So today I would like to talk about how the pandemic has challenged the ideas of the embodied experiences that each of us has lived through during these times. And so as we can see, this pandemic has shown how fragile and vulnerable the concept of the nation state is. And so the borders between countries that have been meticulously erected and guarded have been proven to be ineffective in the face of the virus. And so what we can see is that bodies have always served as a human geography, demarcating this classic division between the us versus the other. And these artificial categories of human hierarchies have demarcated the sides of what it means to be a human being in the first place. So what we can see from the experience of the pandemic is this creation of the blacklists for certain countries that we discussed just before the start of this panel discussion. We have seen the policies that different states introduced, policies that bar migrants from coming, the policies that put the migrants, I'm so sorry, the policies that put the migrants in the forefront of the risk, and that put the human lives in these categories of which lives are valuable and which lives are dispensable. And so echoing the words of Donna Haraway, we can see how the discourse of the body and the nation state has become very extremely medicalized, where we can see that the body and the nation state, they have this intrinsic relationship between each other. And if the primary goal, the idea of the body and immune system to kind of protect the bodily boundaries from the alien viruses, then then we can see the same logic, the same discourse coming into the discourse of the nation state that has to be protected, has to be defended from the irrational, malign intruders that come in the form of migrants that come that come in the form of racialized others, right? So we can see that when there is a idea, when there is a threat of the disease, anyone that is a foreign entity becomes a threat, becomes the racialized other. And so, like the virus invisible to the human eye, migrants arouse fear and frustration of the nation state by challenging the national borders, the notion of the borders, and by doing so, the entire concept of the nation state itself. And so during the pandemic and panic attempts of countries to close their borders and control the flow of all the moving entities, migrants were put in the forefront of scapegoating by accusing them of spreading the virus. So this pandemic has shown once again which bodies are legitimate and which ones are unwanted and should be eliminated. So at this point, I would like to stress that it is very important to consider that when we talk about migrants, we do not talk only about those who cross the geographical boundaries, the borders between states. It is not only about crossing these literal geographical borders, but also the borders of what it means to be normal, right? The borders of what is deemed to be the norm itself. So therefore, the concept of migrant in this case includes queer people, indigenous people, people of color, and others whose bodies and existences are valued as a threat by the privileged majority. So since the notion of the nation state is inherently built upon this colonial, white, heterosexual, and patriarchal norms, anything or anyone that diverges from these norms by default is considered to be alien or an object for riddance. So, and at this point, when we talk about elimination, we talk about the dispensable bodies, we talk about dispensable lives. And in one of the recent discussions, recent interviews, Judith Butler said that these dispensable lives are documented just as mere numbers in the statistics, which lead to dehumanizing these people. However, I would go further and say that unfortunately, most of these marginalized people are not included in the statistics of death tolls by the state. Their deaths are not reflected there. And by denying them deaths, it means that the state denies them their existence, their lives. Therefore, I would like to open the discussion now with questions of, when we talk about returning to normal, what do we mean by normal? Whose normal we imply here? And if it is the norm, if these norms are the ones that have been existing before up until now, then we should always bear in our minds that these norms have only worked for further subjugation and subordination of the oppressed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Altynay, also for sticking to the time limit. If I may just come back on one point and give you the chance to clarify, we'll come to the big questions of the normal and maybe not so normal later on. But you said, and you started by saying that we have seen during the pandemic how fragile and vulnerable the notion of the nation state is. But isn't what you were mostly describing how strong that notion is, maybe sometimes surprisingly strong in such a situation? Or what did you mean by vulnerable?
Well, yeah, what we can see now, the oppression of the marginalized group by the state, it shows that the state is afraid, of losing the grip of the control, that it sees that the borders are not protecting them anymore, that not only the virus itself, because we all understand that virus will go away in a couple of years, but the systemic subjugation of oppressed people, systemic inequalities will remain. And in this sense, this migration of identities in the first place is what poses the biggest threat to the state. Then and it also shows that the idea of the nation state itself is not something that is unchanging, and it's not something static. So that's what I meant by fragility of nation state.
Thank you very much for clarifying that. Okay, we'll come back to some of the points you've raised a bit later, but let's go on to Maksym next.
Thank you very much. Just probably in a way to pick it up a little bit from where it's been left by Altynay and also by Gwendolyn. It's been mentioned, especially at the beginning of the declared pandemic, there were all these reactions which could be read elsewhere, that we are all in the same boat and we are all faced by the same danger, and this that COVID-19 is some sort of great leveler. And this is obviously not the case, at least from what we've seen in the months to come. Those comments I've encountered of this kind were mostly made by either celebrities, including pop celebrities, or by some politicians of a kind, but they all represented a certain part, a certain group of countries and a certain populations, which can be regarded rather as privileged, not as those who are underprivileged. Speaking from my personal, my colleagues' experience of these previous months, and our perspective is a human rights perspective in the first place, and also a perspective of freedom of movement, to what extent it is restricted, to what extent it is preserved. And freedom of movement has been the first victim to the lockdown measures during the pandemic. We've seen it in different countries. Our first-hand experience is, of course, Ukrainian one. I've said elsewhere about a year ago that Ukraine has never experienced so many borders in its modern history as it does now. And this became even more true during the pandemic. I mean, if we take these last 29 years today, actually, as I mentioned to colleagues, today is Ukraine's Independence Day. So 29 years ago, Ukraine as an independent state came into existence on the international stage. And Ukraine's outer borders are more controlled and more strict than ever. First, the northern and eastern borders were rather porous, as Republic of Belarus and Russian Federation were regarded as too close entities to harshly manage the borders with them. And the western borders became enforced mostly from the western side, from the European Union, but also by the Ukrainian side, stimulated by the European Union. With the beginning of Russian-Ukrainian war, the northern border became really enforced. But also we have these internal borders, like the administrative border with the Crimean Peninsula, controlled by Russia, and also the line of contact in the east of Ukraine, in the war zone. And with the arrival of lockdown measures, we have borders or checkpoints, at least, between different regions of Ukraine, while people traveling from one region to another would suddenly come across the checkpoint where their IDs were controlled and their purpose of visit or travel was checked. So it restricted even further that already problematic ability to move around freely, which was enjoyed by people arriving to Ukraine or staying in Ukraine. And this was even more obvious when it comes to newly arrived asylum seekers or refugees. For the 3 springtime months, during the most harsh lockdown imposed in Ukraine, the State Migration Service, the main migration body dealing with asylum in the country, declared that it will accept statements or claims only in certain cases, and asylum was not among them. Asylum seekers basically had nowhere to go if they arrived or they found themselves in need to claim asylum during the lockdown period of time. And it was, I'm not sure if it was an intent of the migration service, of the authorities. They seemed to be just unworthy special mention or special measures to help them through these difficult lockdown times. And working in the field of human rights with several other marginalized or unprivileged groups, I could see how lockdown measures affected a lot of them by simply denying them an opportunity to travel from a village or a town to the regional center if they are in need of urgent medical assistance. These are Roma communities or people who live with HIV or people who inject drugs and are clients of substitution therapy program, which exists in Ukraine. They were all kind of forgotten in these lockdown measures, and they could not really perform their everyday rituals, which aimed at saving their lives. And the state never bothered providing them with any alternative, actually. So we've seen more restricted freedom of movement than ever, but also increased number and quality of control mechanisms. For the first time in years, the state obliged the population to carry ID papers on them when going to the streets, and it's not been around since Soviet times. There was a limit on how many people can gather in public spaces, not more than 3 persons, which really resembles, like, worst case examples from, again, from the past. But these are old-fashioned measures of control, while new-fashioned measures were employed. It's been announced that at least in Kiev, the city authorities always complaining about a deficient budget, suddenly announced that they will purchase CCTV cameras for video surveillance on the streets, equipped not only with face recognition technology, but also with distant body temperature measure technologies, which has never been in place in Ukraine. So temperature scanners, face recognition technologies, and special application for mobile phones controlled by the state and imposed as an obligation upon everyone who crosses the contact line, for instance, or the international border, are something very new as measures of control. And while the most harsh lockdown measures were lifted by the time we speak, some of them stayed, and some of them definitely can be reactivated as soon as they're needed. And I would like to conclude with one, I think, important remark. All these measures, they provoked protests from certain part of population, but the majority met them with indifference, not because they were not uncomfortable, they were. Not because they were all rational, actually some of them were not. And later on, the state authorities had to confess that these and those limitations were imposed for no medical necessity, but just to scare the population off. For instance, prohibition to go to park zones in the cities. The difference from all previous examples of imposing control by the state authorities was that this time everything was done to present it not as a political decision and not as a political line which could be protested against, but as something caused by natural causes. It's a natural emergency. So the state authorities are forced to impose the control measures which, if treated as a political line and purely political decision, would be met with massive and radical protests from the population, but not if they are caused by a virus. So it was a universal justification for these new control measures. And as far as most of them break actually Ukrainian law, some of them, as I mentioned, stay in place. And it seems that under this new justification can be reactivated at any point in time. I think I'll just stop here and we'll be happy to take part in discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe I can also pick up on one thing you said right away, that there was a sort of a specific justification for the control measures imposed, like in Ukraine, as in sort of all over the world where measures were imposed, and that the argument is sort of quite a specific one, and it's not, and therefore maybe also not we didn't see the reaction right away against control measures. If they were motivated or explained differently, probably in particular in Ukraine, we would have seen maybe more reaction to it. But does that not also suggest that these control measures and the ability of somebody to impose them are limited because it is a specific type of argumentation? But you seem to suggest that your expectation is that they're not temporary, that this is something the state can now use and therefore will use.
Yes, I would agree on that, of course, because there are limitations to which this excuse or this justification can be used. On the other hand, this is an unfolding story for me, and I still have to see the way it goes in a quite specific way. I'm not sure if it's the same elsewhere, not only in Ukraine, but in Ukraine, the further the story progresses. And currently, again, as we speak, the per day registered numbers of newly infected persons are higher than at any point in time during the harsh lockdown. But it seems that a lot of people realize they cannot draw the line between well-grounded, medically approved measures imposed by the state and those measures imposed by the authorities which pretend to be well-grounded but actually are not. So the further it goes, the more often one can meet the reaction among the public. It's all basically cheating, and we are not sure anymore what is truth and what is politics, and where the medical side of it and where the political control over my body is. So I would better react to everything as if it's the one, and try to sometimes follow the measures and the control the limitations, and sometimes I'll have to cheat on them, and this is story really in development, but I'm really cautious to say what way it will go.
I think you just mentioned a really important aspect there, the sense of uncertainty in society, also in politics, and then that I think is an important aspect in also driving perhaps fear or anger and also policies that might follow. We will come back to some of that, but let's also hear Estela.
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to suggest a couple of points for reflection and for the discussion, also picking up on something what has been said already. But first, I would like to comment on one of the points which is mentioned in the invitation to the panel, which may not be directly related to migration, but I think it is, which is, again, the issue of inequalities. Because I think it's important to keep in mind the extent to which the pandemic and also in part the measures taken against its effects are reproducing and amplifying already existing inequalities. And I wanted to quote, mention that an article I read last week at the Deutsche Welle website from a German TV broadcaster, where it says that the main market stock exchange are in party mood. That was the expression used, because in spite of the fears due to the pandemic, the world stock exchanges are actually registering record profits at the present. So I think that I couldn't understand that, because we read that there will be a worldwide contraction of the economy. We know that millions of people around the world are losing their jobs and may lose their homes, and many more will probably do. So that the financial markets are profiting and earning huge amounts of money. In the meanwhile, to me, is like an appalling demonstration of the degree of disconnection between the financial markets and the so-called real economy, the production economy. And again, this may not have to do directly with migration, but I think is an indicator of the extent of the inequality of our world that the pandemic may only making deeper. And sometimes I think we social sciences should understand more about finances. At least I wish I would, but I wanted to mention that anyway, because as a first point, I think the persistence and amplification of inequalities is a point that cannot be overstressed. Second point in terms of the discussion, what is the normal to return to? I would like to pose a question, okay, what is actually new and what is maybe not so new about what is happening right now? And what I would like to remind here, and it has to do with what Maksym just said, is that the vocabulary of crisis has been often used to introduce exceptions that will then later remain and become the normal. So that the framing of a crisis usually allows for the experimentation or for the introduction of instruments of governmentality that will then persist. And to go to a concrete example of the European borders, that is what happened, for instance, with the hotspot approach in the management of European borders. The hotspots in Italy and Greece, as you know, are territories, mainly islands, where the right of asylum is suspended and replaced by another set of rules that applies only on those places, on those islands, like these 5 Greek islands, and where persons that are seeking international protection are subjected to a differentiated regime of entitlements to the right or to the access to asylum. So we have been reading already before the pandemic that the living conditions at the hotspots, especially in the Greek islands, are inhuman, are extreme, can't be sustained anymore. And for instance, the biggest one of the island of Lesbos, where the facilities have been built for just a few hundred persons, and the last report from some German parliamentarians last week mentions 12,000 people living there in conditions in which, of course, is impossible to keep any standard of hygiene or social distancing in order to prevent the spread of the virus. But I think if we put it in context, again, I think that what we learned from the so-called hotspot approach, and I wanted to call attention to the situation right now, but on a more general sense, I think we need to be alert to the vocabularies of crisis and discern what is new and what is not new, and what is a continuation of previously existing tendencies, because the hotspot approach was introduced in a moment where what was framed as a refugee crisis or a migration crisis, but then it persisted over the years. So I think this also teaches something in terms of what is new and what is not new in the global mobility regime. And this leads me to my next point, which is I think since the travel and mobility restrictions were introduced due to the pandemic, there is a certain narrative according to which, well, we used to live in an interconnected, globalized world of high mobility, and now borders are being reintroduced, borders are being reenacted, are becoming relevant again. And I think it is important to relativize this narrative, because I don't think that what is going on is actually new. I think that's something border scholars, border researchers have been stating for long, namely that this image of a globalized, borderless world does not really fit the reality, but borders, walls, separation are as much an integral part of the globalized geographies as are also circulation and mobility. What scholars rather refer to is the emergence of a regime of differential entitlements to mobility and travel, because cities and populations across the world are differentially entitled to move across borders. And I think here I would just connect to what Altynay was saying about bodies that are deemed as more or less legitimate for certain mobilities. And actually borders have always been set and reinforced or lifted and made light according to the military, political, economical, or logistical needs of their times. And even the Schengen regime of the European Union, that meant that the inner borders of the member states among member states are being erased, has actually been activated in the past also once and again whenever it was deemed necessary already before the pandemic. For instance, in relation to the attempts at containing migration between member states in 2015, 2016. So the third point I would like to make here is that there is maybe less an experimentation than a continuation or a deepening of already existing tendency, and maybe rather an exacerbation of the differential access to mobility that was there already before the pandemic, and which we can fear that it will get also more extreme. And what was the plan? What was going on in terms of European borders when the pandemic started? Well, basically the smart borders package of the European Union, which means, among other things, the integration of biometric technologies of border control that are resorting more and more towards integrating the physicality of the human body into the citizen identification. And here I see a connection again to what Altynay was saying, because what experts observe is a tendency to put in to alert about how there is a connection between the markers of citizenship, of belonging, of institutional belonging to the state and the body itself, and that this connection is becoming more intimate. So this presents a risk of biases and of risk of racializing discrimination in the border control, which are now being inscribed in the biometric technology. So scholars have been pointing out at the degree in which, for instance, biometric algorithms are coded in a way that certain bodies are more difficult to read or to enroll and to process than others, and how this may lead to new modes of segregation, discrimination, and stratification of mobilities. And of course, the pandemic here is introducing a new element, which is related to the serologic condition or to the immune condition. So these already existing systems of biometric identification, which are based on indicators or markers like the iris, the face pattern, the fingerprints, may now be complemented with what we are reading this in this time, like the serologic passport, the serologic tests, the immunity passports. And so they may advance a big step into this conflation of the physicality of the body and the instruments of civil identification and entitlement to rights. So where the body used to be, in the modern political tradition, used to be regarded as an inviolable, stable unit, through the biometric technologies may be becoming more fragmented and more subject to these maybe discriminating operations. So I want to be careful here, not be misunderstood. I don't mean at all that states should not be testing. I just want to put this in the context of concerns raised over the racialized biases and data privacy issues that have been raised in regard to biometric identification. So as a fourth point, the question, what does it mean that the border control becomes so intimate with the body? This leads to some paradoxical questions in relation to the biopolitical governance and the return of a bigger role of the state, and what may be seems like a contradiction between the neoliberal paradigm where the state is not intervening and the biological paradigm where the state is again very active in taking care of the population, but also in controlling it. I don't want to expand much about this now, but I think this is something we can return to maybe during the discussion, because Maksym was mentioning how there is a coexistence in the case of Ukraine of what you called old-fashioned and newer forms of control. And I think we may be observing that in terms of how older and newer forms of biopolitical control are taking place. Maybe there is more to say about that. In a more, maybe in a more hopeful tone or a more bright tone, I'm seeing at Gwendolyn's desk this sign, look at the bright side of life. It may be difficult to think of something bright in this actually really worrying, really dark scenario. But maybe to put it in a more hopeful tone, I want to pose that maybe the pandemic also may have made us more aware of the contingency and vulnerability of the global entanglements and of the connections and chains of care, of delivery, of production that sustain our material and our unaffected lives. And I would like to close by mentioning a piece by Judith Butler, who was already mentioned by Altynay in her talk, where she reflects about the surfaces and how the surfaces of contact are now maybe more than ever making us aware of what it means, how we are in contact with the world. Back then when she wrote, we thought that the virus can be spread more through surfaces. By now we don't know that exactly, but it's a very, I think, beautiful reflection on how surfaces and the transit, the traffic of surfaces, for example, when we receive a letter per post, may reconstruct this change of entanglements of the globalized condition. I just want to quote one sentence from his text. He wrote, "If we did not know before that we share the surfaces of the world, we do now." So like this sort of new awareness. And I prepared here the link because the article is available online. It's actually a short text, and I thought also because it's so nice, if it's okay, I can copy the link at the chat. And otherwise I would leave it here, and maybe we can pick up some of these topics in the discussion.
Thank you very much. I think you described really well there how technologies, also new technologies, can become part of everyday practice, and then that can have consequences too. I think it connects also with what both Altynay and Maksym were saying too. I would like to kind of pass on a question you just raised, Estela, and I was going to raise it in our discussion now too. And that's the question whether we see actual fundamental change, or if we see, that could still be kind of a new development, but if we see a reinforcement of trends that have always been there, and now during a pandemic, in a crisis, if we want to use that term, maybe we don't want to use it, but certain things get amplified, or we see them more because it's a different lens onto developments. But are there also things that are actually changing? And I would like to give this back to Maksym and Altynay. Maybe we start with you, Maksym, and then we go to Altynay. How do you see that? I mean, I think you touched on aspects of that, but maybe we can draw that out a bit more. Maybe we start with that, Maksym, this time.
Thank you. Well, this is the question. I'm afraid it's really difficult to ask, at least at the moment, because on one hand, some things which we're witnessing now, at least, I mean, talking from the Eastern European and more narrowly Ukrainian perspective, some things are really tempting to be dubbed something new, like something radically new. Even I've said something which has never been seen before in all the years of Ukrainian history. But if we look closer, I would put it to a real test. I would sincerely doubt it. It's rather than if we take a look at every new measure of control or every something new which has been manifestly inserted in our everyday lives. If we look closely, we will see probably something which has been there, maybe was not that visible. Maybe it was something not really people would like to acknowledge, or the authorities never used something so unapologetically. For instance, what's also been mentioned on on the inequalities. When it comes to inequalities, I really see that existing inequalities which already existed and in the society, they were deepened and made more visible by the pandemic, by the lockdown, by the new measures, all these limitations and things. But then when we turn to these new measures of control, they are new for Ukraine. They are not that new internationally or globally, but a lot of them are actually tied to who is basically underline the divide between rich and poor, let's put it simply. If we talk about very basic thing which has been introduced in Ukraine as well, these mobile applications which people had to use in order to prove their whereabouts to the state authorities. And this was the condition under which they didn't have to go under 2 weeks quarantine, not being locked up for 2 weeks. They can be installed upon smartphones, but they, of course, cannot be installed upon old-fashioned mobile phones, you know, with buttons. And this means that actually all those people who are in quite destitute economic situation, who had to cross the contact line in the war zone in the east, if they went to the Ukrainian controlled territory to get their pension, most probably they had these old-fashioned phones and they could not install this application. So they couldn't abide the new obligations and they couldn't cross, or they had to be locked up. Or when with public transport being abandoned between different regions and the cities, the private transportation was still allowed. So those who either possessed a vehicle or could pay for a private ride could enjoy moving around the country, while all the others could not. And this somehow seems very familiar when there is a strong state presence in terms of control, while those who privately can afford better services, conditions, and ways out are allowed to do so. This is quite a typical, neoliberal model. So with all new gadgets and all new control measures, there is nothing really new at the core of it. And the last example, not to take too much time, when we talk about strengthening of the borders or re-erecting the borders, international ones, I totally agree to what Estela has just said, that there has never been a borderless world, of course, if one looks from the perspective of the global south. And Ukrainians, population of Ukraine or bearers of the Ukrainian passport experienced it very well until very recently, when just a couple of years ago, Ukraine has been awarded a visa-free travel to the European Union. Before, everyone knew who traveled abroad westwards what it means to happen on, say, the EU border with the Ukrainian passport. And the very same happened to people who found themselves at the Ukrainian borders, and still happens now, bearing passport of a national of Uzbekistan or Tajikistan. This pre-selection of people from worthy and unworthy countries, more and less valuable, desirables and undesirables, it's been there, and also it's been there reinforced by some formal control measures which were in place. This time it's just been reinforced, but I wouldn't say there was something radically new imposed. So I'm not sure if I can with certainty answer the question, but I would rather say we see dramatic developments of something which has already been there, and just it is used more openly and manifestedly and unapologetically, I would say.
Thank you. Altynay, do you want to come in on this as well, in terms of whether something fundamentally new is happening or it's reinforcing existing trends?
Yeah, I would also like to pick up on the last couple of sentences that Estela mentioned about the looking at the pandemic as some sort of opportunity to look at the current existing systemic inequalities. I would like to caution at this point, because caution to romanticize the pandemic, because unfortunately the oppressed groups has always been aware of these inequalities, and what we can see now is that despite the fact that some few of those privileged groups of people finally have seen the problem, it is not enough, and it can be all quite late, right? And to acknowledge that there is a problem, that there is a systemic problem that has to be challenged on all the levels, existing levels. And at the same time, going to the brighter side, I would also like to stress that this pandemic has to change our focus from the state itself as this machine, as this omnipresent machine that controls all of our existence, to the grassroots empowerment instances, when people actually took over the obligations and the role of the state. And this is where the inadequacy of the nation state comes, because for example, we see from I don't know about the European case, but at least in cases of post-Soviet states, we see that citizens have taken over the roles of the states when it comes to public health, when it comes to public services, right? Grassroots initiatives like the ones that I work for, we have taken over the services. We provided the services, mental health services, public health care services, human rights, right? And so, and at this point, the state has proven to be absolutely useless for the citizens, because people were dying, and the basic conditions for survival were not provided by the state. And if we talk about this classical model of Leviathan, when we give up our rights, right, especially that is applicable to the post-Soviet countries, where the human rights are infringed on a daily basis, then the question is, why are we paying this price of giving up our rights if even the mere, the lowest level of providing the life is not provided as well by the state? So I think these are the brighter perspectives that we have to look at, that where people, the citizens, are challenging the ideas of the state from below. So, yeah.
I just maybe take you up on that point and ask, do you see the beginnings of that in Kazakhstan? I suppose one example we could also point to these days is Belarus, where the ignoring the pandemic on the president's part also led to what you're describing, more self-help organization from below, and it has at least fed into the next stage of the events that we've been witnessing. I'm not saying that it's the same going on in Kazakhstan, but you could say on the one hand, it's also convenient for the state if these issues that the state doesn't have the capacity to address, in particular, for example, in the health sector, if organization from below helps to address that. That per se does not, maybe is not sufficient to call into question the consensus you yourself described beforehand on all the strength maybe of the state. I mean, how do you see that playing out in the context that you are observing? I mean, it could be actually backing the state, and it's because it's not having to deal with some of the issues.
Well, for me, one of the not so obvious examples of people not trusting the state anymore with providing the survival is their refusal to get vaccination. So, so the one of the most, I think, prominent discourses is that there are these people, neoliberal people, privileged people who are denying to get vaccinated, etc., etc., or those who are uneducated, who have less education. But in case of Kazakhstan, and we can see that citizens do not trust the state anymore. They do not want to give up their bodies. The first and foremost thing that they own, and that is the side of their like independence, right? So, and I think this is where we have to look, where we have to think, and if the state wants to buttress again its role, then probably it should think what I can give back to the people. So yeah, and as you mentioned, what we are observing now in Belarus is a perfect example, right? How the state apparatus failed, absolutely.
Maybe what you're describing, this erosion of trust, is another example of where something gets reinforced. There was already, I suppose, certain trust issues before, and maybe this is now, it gets amplified as well, and the outcome of that might be open. I keep sort of looking at the chat. I can't see the Facebook chat, but I see our chat here. There's not many questions there yet, so please, everybody listening in, get ready and post some questions there. But I'll continue sort of asking a few questions in the meantime. And I wanted to go back to you, Estela, as well, because you highlighted, and I think rightly so, the importance of the narrative as well, and who the framing of what is happening, and how that's how I understood it, how one could perhaps also differentiate between what is or seems medically necessary, how you communicate that, how you frame it, and when it enters into some other realm of framing. And I wanted to give you the opportunity to unpack that a bit more. I mean, who do you think managed to have their voices heard more in the framing, both at the level of kind of EU member states, but also the EU as a whole, as that's kind of more the part of Europe you're dealing with?
Yeah, well, that's a very broad question. I want to be very careful about saying something very assertive about that. But maybe two things. One, in reaction to your question, I think one of the difficulties when it comes to the framing and the communication is that we are in a political context where it's more and more about easy formulations, about emotions, about simplifying, polarizing. We are observing that, I think, all around the world. And in this case, we are dealing actually with the timings and the rhythms and the pace of science, which are completely different. And then there is this irritation of the audiences and of the public about how comes first we weren't supposed to wear masks and now we have to wear masks, and how comes that the states are changing, shifting their discourses, their positions. And I think maybe one of the difficulties is just to communicate it well. Yes, that's the way science works, by trial and error, by rehearsing, by experimenting, by failing, right? And maybe one of the problems is, by all the, how can I say, postmodern deconstruction that modern science has been object of in the last decades. We are now very much relying in science as probably the best equipped system and actor in condition of helping us out of the pandemic. And of course, the answers of science are always provisory and contingent, because that's just the way science works. So I think that's one of the difficulties in terms of the narratives and the framing. And then I would also like to comment on what Altynay just said in terms of the failure of the state in the context you are describing, because my impression reading it from from Germany, from Western Europe, but also because I follow the news maybe in Latin America, in my home country, Argentina, which is a different context, is that actually the state is acquiring again a very more prominent role. So you said citizens have taken the role of the state. Well, I'm seeing contexts where actually the state is taking the role of the state again. And this may also be a shift after what we have seen in some contexts as a very a tendency towards like making the state thin and staying with the neoliberal paradigm of, you know, like the market regulates itself and the companies become more relevant actors, and actually the state is not intervening into taking care of its citizens so much, but rather abandoning them, letting them out of the system, like a new paradigm of intervention or non-intervention. And I think in some contexts, what we have seen is like, again, this very strong role of the state along like the economic packages of help issued by the national state, but also by the European Union in huge amounts. That is something that contradicts what seemed to be like the new neoliberal dogma of so little state intervention as possible. And there is where I see like this sort of paradoxical new coming of the good old biopolitical state, which intervenes and takes care of the citizens' lives and say, you know, you have to take care, you need to wash your hands, you need to wear a mask, you need, that's like a very active role of the state, which actually we had been seen withdrawn in the last decade. So that may be different in the context you, Altynay, were describing, but it's what I observe in other contexts. And of course, it's different in the different European member states. It was not the initial position of Boris Johnson, but it was, I think, the one taken by the other states like Germany or France or Italy.
I think that last point you made is a very important one too, not to say that there's clearly variation. So I think sometimes when we discuss these issues, it can become sort of very black and white. No? So I think policy approaches were and are still different as are state and society responses. So I think that will be something that will keep all of us researchers and activists busy for a very long time. I mean, among the aspects that we haven't really touched on, and I'd like to sort of ask you, Altynay, if you could maybe briefly put that in perspective for us, is the gender dimension or dimensions connected to gender in this during the pandemic, and we haven't really explicitly addressed that, but it is obviously linked to mobility, to migration, different types of migration, inequalities. Could you perhaps sort of share a few of your thoughts on that with us?
Yeah, I think so. What we have clearly seen over this last month is that how pandemic hasn't, like as Maksym and Estela have already said, that how pandemic didn't affect all the groups equally, right? Despite the initial these calls that, oh, this pandemic is kind of egalitarian heaven, right? However, when it comes to women, we also have to talk about the racialized dimension, right, of gender, racialized, and it also includes the migration. So when we talk about Europe, we always have to keep in mind how the labor itself, the racialized and genderized labor is not visible, right? So we're used to the fact that someone always cleans after us, but we have, but rarely do we think about the person standing behind this labor. And so I think during this pandemic, we all see that the economy of care has become one of the major topics for most of the panel discussions, discussing how women were unfairly touched by this challenges. But at the same time, we always have to also urge that we should also try to avoid looking at the gender dimension only from this perspective of sex division, right? When we look only at the division of people by the roles at home, at the household, but also have to look at the socio-economic statuses, because for example, the narratives of sex workers, they are the ones that have been unseen almost, right, in most of the discourses of gendered aspects of pandemic. So we don't know what is happening with migrant sex workers, because Central Asia, to be honest, has been one of the major countries that migrate to Russia, and the center, this metropole center of Central Asian migrants, and thousands of them have been stuck since the borders have been closed. And when we think in the intersection, not only of the COVID-19 pandemic, but when we also think about the HIV, right, the pandemic that has been silenced for such a long time, and this discourses that we are now seeing with COVID-19 is not new. We are seeing the same logic, the same rhetoric of war against the virus, right? Of defending the boundaries. This has always been there with HIV virus as well, where the certain bodies were deemed to be inappropriate and open for elimination. And so when we think about the gender dimension of the pandemic, we have always think of the intersectional approach. So in Kazakhstan, unfortunately, what I can see is that most of the conversation about the gendered aspect of the pandemic ends and limits only with the household labor. And it is true that women are having much more to do now than men regarding the household chores and regarding and also they are having been suffering much more domestic violence. This is all true, but we always have to include in these conversations marginalized women, women of color, queer women as well, because lesbian and bisexual women are also eliminated from these conversations, unfortunately. And so, yeah.
Thank you very much for also emphasizing those intersections. Kirill, let me know if there's anything coming in via Facebook. I still don't really see anybody in our chat. Okay. Then there's another question I wanted to, it's unfortunately this format, feel free to also react to each other more, no? And then just switch your microphones on. Otherwise, I feel it's a little bit like sort of that I just call upon you, which is not really conducive to the discussion. So by all means, come in, and just when the sound gets problematic, we need to kind of switch ourselves off again in between. But one whole kind of broader issue, and maybe others want to come in too, but maybe I start with you, Maksym, is the issue of return migration, because in my perception, that doesn't really get much attention either, and Ukraine is a well, good, if that's the right word, example of it, that there's been a lot of return migration, voluntary and not so voluntary, and what are also implications of that? I mean, it really puts notions of citizenship to yet another test if people come back, and it on the one hand, I would think increases also the precarious situation of households depending on migrants sending remittances. On the other hand, is the state and is society ready to receive back people from abroad in such a crisis? So I think it's a particular setting that probably deserves some attention as well. I don't know if you can comment a bit on that, or how you see that and what's really happening in Ukraine in response to this. these are large numbers of people. I don't have the exact figures, but when we're not talking just a few thousand people, these are large numbers.
Yes, definitely, and thank you, Gwendolyn, for this one. I presume also that we're so used nowadays to all these our Zoom meetings online that we have this Zoom ethic of communication, which should keep our mics off. Otherwise, we cannot hear each other. So, no surprise. But yeah, that was a very good notion. Yeah, on the return migration, actually, this is a very interesting what we've witnessed when it comes to Ukraine specifically. I'm saying specifically because Ukraine is the country of origin of labor migrants in huge numbers when it comes to not only the EU countries, but also to Russian Federation. Up to now, even under the current political settings, still there are a lot of people who go to work in Russia. I mean, went to work before the pandemic and lockdown, etc., started. So we've talked originally about some dozens of thousands of persons who were stranded somewhere or who actually managed to come back to Ukraine before the borders were locked down. And this is definitely not this black and white picture one would be tempted to paint, as the reactions were very mixed. As a rule, they were perceived, I mean, in general, labor migrants perceived by the majority of Ukrainian population as, well, in a positive light, to put it mildly. It's not to say that they're heroes of the communities, but this is some very accepted strategy of gaining means for living. And a lot of people actually understand, especially in some geographical areas, how important labor migrants are for communities as the whole, to, sending their children to get education and paying for that with money earned abroad, or coming back and opening new small businesses. So it's all kind of acknowledged, but especially at the beginning of pandemic, we've witnessed several reactions which were exactly the opposite. And it, of course, it was, they provoked shockwaves among Ukrainian society. For instance, there was this first case of several dozens of Ukrainian nationals who were shipped back from China, directly from Wuhan region. And they were destined to stay at the medical facility for 2 weeks to be monitored. None of them turned out to be infected. But when it became clear which medical facility, and that has been, by the way, not an ordinary but militarized National Guard medical facility, when it became clear which one will be picked up, there were spontaneous protests by local population, which turned here and there into riots, and there were clashes with the police, etc. While it was very clear that the state authorities were not up to the task of at least some proper communication with local community, it's also been clear that the protesters, they basically, it was very spontaneous and very irrational reaction, and they acknowledged it. They didn't have any demands, but get them out of our region. And the fact that they are Ukrainian nationals as much as those who protested, and that this could happen to a relative of a protester didn't really change much. It was extremely irrational. And there was not an isolated case. There were protests here and there in different regions of Ukraine. So it was a strange sight to see this happening at the same time as seeing these networks of solidarity being developed, the one mentioned by Altynay and mentioned before, when people really got together, helped each other, tried to help those who could not leave their house, being under medical monitoring, or tried to collect money for doctors, for medical personnel in the first place. All these things happened simultaneously. Later on, before the borders were properly closed, number of returned migrants came from a few dozens or hundreds into thousands and dozens of thousands, and they didn't provoke any outrage or any negative reaction anymore. Somehow it took quite a short but some time for communities to get to terms with it. Even though it was observed that, of course, to people who came back to the cities and had to go further to their smaller towns or their villages, some of them preferred to stay in the cities. They felt safer in closely knit communities, in smaller communities, and usually poorer communities than the cities. They were afraid to experience more negative reaction than otherwise. But in general, yeah, and Ukrainian society, if I can generalize on that, was actually demanding from the state to ensure return of Ukrainian nationals who were abroad. Even those who were stranded, not working abroad, but stranded at some international tourist resorts. And there were people, of course, of this kind. Even them, quite a lot of them could not pay for their return ticket, which was an obligation, and managed to get back. But a lot of Ukrainians were unhappy that the state did not provide adequate care or adequate reaction. And also, there is a case which I'm personally, for instance, dealing with at the moment with Ukrainian nationals stranded in Russia. They are detained in the detention center. I mean, in detention centers. There are several dozens of them in Russian Federation for months now, and they cannot go back because there is no direct transport communication between Russia and Ukraine at the moment. It all should be done via some other country. And it's interesting that they seem to be forgotten. And at least publicly, Ukrainian authorities did not react up to now to Ukrainian nationals who found themselves stranded in Russia, which I presume is a reflection of Ukrainian Russian and political situation at the moment. But yeah, you know, this reaction was mixed, and at first it was really shocking, I would say. But then we've seen it being more neutral and coming back. On this, probably I can say that it was coming back to normal, meaning Ukrainian labor migrants started to be perceived again by their communities as before. At the same time, I would support, probably not on that level, but support the notion of networks of solidarity, which has been mentioned before. Just probably to add one more thing, we experienced this citizens replacing the state structures thing as well, but it was much more obvious and more logistically complicated in the years 2014, 2016, after protests at Maidan and beginning of the war, when really it's been a huge movement actually replacing state structures in certain areas. And as much as it was inspiring, we also have witnessed that the state authorities in some places actually abused it and exploited it, capitalizing on what has been done by the civil society structures and refraining from, the logic was they're doing this or you are doing this anyway, why should we step in? But it doesn't mean that they didn't want to be state authorities anymore. They just wanted to exploit it. And now these networks of solidarity are much weaker than they used to be. Maybe also the room for maneuver and the area how people can help is much more limited.
Thank you. You've already picked up along the way without seeing the question about a possible return of Ukrainians from Russia, but you've already sort of addressed that now, that was not kind of the focal point of attention. There are a number of questions coming in asking about the already happening or potential impacts of the pandemic on states' migration policies. And in one question referred it to the issue of return migration, if that immediately has an impact, but also the broader question to all of you, if you think and where do you think migration policies will be going forward, will be affected. I don't know who wants to make a start, maybe Estela or Altynay.
Well, I think my answer would be quite brief because due to the fact that Kazakhstan was the only Central Asian country that it was rich to natural resources, we had this Dutch disease, and which also played as a factor for having low numbers of working migrants, like the Kazakhstani people rarely go to as migrants to the neighboring countries, especially to Russia. They go as migrants, but for well-paid jobs, and there is this socioeconomic difference between the migrants from other Central Asian countries, and so I think and then the term that is coined to the migrants that go from Kazakhstan is this fancy term of brain drain, right? Brain drainers, and and the number of them is not so high. And I think the government is not so much interested in investing into any policy specific changes regarding the migration. And another aspect is that Kazakhstan is a receiving country for migrants from other Central Asian countries and more from other countries of global South, including African states. And the practice shows that on a policy level, the state is inadequate to answer the challenges when the migrants have been stuck here and were not provided any health services. So my greatest hope is that the state would finally start considering a comprehensive migrant policies, including some kind of guarantees for migrants who are residing in the country, not necessarily to ethnic Kazakhs leaving the Kazakhstani citizens leaving the state, but for those who are coming here.
Estela, did you want to come in on this as well?
Yeah. Well, I think it's very difficult to make any prognosis, but I wouldn't expect any pro-migration changes in regards to the pandemic. On the opposite, on another side, among other things, the pandemic revealed I'm speaking from Germany now, and I don't want to generalize for the whole European Union at all, but in national terms, I think the pandemic also put more clear the extreme need of care personnel in Germany, and usually also migration regulation is related to the need for workforce, so that may bring some flexibilization, but otherwise it rather seems that all attempts into advancing new or more open migration policies will be frozen for a while.
I think the question was open in both directions. So if it's not the more open policies, do we expect, or do you expect more restrictive, concrete restrictive measures?
I think the status quo is quite restrictive already. Of course, it can be attached to new biopolitical measures like the one we were discussing, like declaring large areas of the world or countries as risk zones and inhibiting, I mean, already now in this moment, only European Union passport holders and EU residents can enter the European Union. I mean, it's already been very restrictive also for regular travel, not only for migration. So I think the status quo is already quite restrictive. But I would be very careful with making long-term prognosis about how it may develop.
I think somebody comes in live, right? Yes.
There is a question from one of the participants of the summer school. So Katerina, you're welcome to ask your question.
We can't hear anything yet.
Oh, yeah. Do you hear me? Yeah?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Thank you for this discussion. I have a question for, I think all panelists. There is no doubt that the pandemic has not only made visible, but exacerbated already existing economic and social inequalities. Still, I would like to ask you if, in your opinion, the pandemic can be perceived not only as a catastrophe, but also as an open situation containing some new opportunities for rethinking and possibly transforming the structure of our world. Because, for example, it is true that we are witnessing right now the strengthening of national borders, the emergence of new forms of control, etc. But we also saw that many nation states were forced to take control of private companies to regulate the economy, which until recently was considered completely impossible. So perhaps you can name other examples that we can consider as positive shifts. Thank you.
Let me briefly check with Kirill. Was there anything else happening in Facebook? Any comments? And I think this is a perfect final question, and you all have a possibility to answer. And it's really looking forward and picks up really this learning element as well. So I don't mind who starts, who wants to jump in first. Nobody. That's impossible.
Well, I can I can start and
Perfect. Thank you.
kind of go back to the discussion that we had previously, right? On the discussion on the speech of Estela regarding the perceiving of a pandemic as this gateway for reconceptualization of existing inequalities. And I think it is a great chance. And we have already discussed about the examples of great chains of solidarity and networks of solidarity when these acts of kindness have come from below. And I think this is the great example of we have to shift our focus from the atrocities that the states have been doing regarding in relation to marginalized communities, oppressed communities. But at the same time, when we talk about the positive example of the states taking the control over the private companies, we also have to keep in mind the final ends of such policies, right? Why the state is taking over these private companies. Because when the states are taking the private companies, the final goal is the revival of the economy, and where this economy is still existing within this neoliberal colonial system of values, where the human being's value is still measured by the capitalist values, by the profit that it can bring. And so when we bring into this discourse that of the benign state taking control over the private sector, we should also be kind of a realist, knowing that behind this logic is still the neoliberalism. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Where we go? Yes, Maksym.
Yeah, I agree on what's been mentioned several times, and I've mentioned that as well, that there is a positive side of solidarity, and also I would probably think of it myself or for myself in terms of lockdown making bare some foundations or cornerstones which otherwise remain sort of concealed in everyday situations. Again, that very same everyday economic inequality has never been as visible as it is now, as a lot of people actually lost their jobs, and the first ones were precarious jobs. So all the talk about precariousness, which in Ukraine until certain moment has been perceived as something, rather academic and imported from elsewhere from the West suddenly became an everyday reality. Precarious workers lost. Discussion which is quite alive and kicking in Ukraine on domestic violence and the role of the state in prevention and reaction became sharper and more visible due to, again, increase in reports on domestic violence when both partners or the whole family have been locked in the same apartment for days and days, which of course increased the risks and decreased the options for the one who suffers violence to escape, to flee. And for instance, it's also first time, at least in several years, as far as I remember, when there is some discussion on homeless persons and homeless people, which became physically visible in these deserted cities and on deserted streets. So these vulnerable, a lot of these vulnerable and unprivileged groups, apart from obviously being targeted more than some others, they also have become more visible. And it might sound strange, don't get me wrong, but this is a positive side, the fact that people start to discuss their situations not because they belong to these groups, but because they suddenly realize on everyday level they live next to them and they actually live together in the same communities and they should do something about it. And also this fact that inequalities became unapologetically demonstrated. I think it is important because, you know, Ukraine still has a very outdated clause in the constitution that it is a social state with all the social rights preserved, and that human rights is the very sense of the state's existence. It's always been regarded, you know, as something outdated, of course, for obvious reasons, but now it is looked upon from somehow different perspective. And probably one more thing, actually, these control measures which were imposed, which affected in the first place public gatherings, including political rallies, they were perceived as something which is there, but quite soon people started to break it, and political rallies are in place, and they were in place, organized by different forces, and police somehow doesn't dare to disperse them. But there is a discussion how far can the state go, even under pandemic circumstances, limiting civil rights and liberties, and to what extent it is feasible, and what are the mechanisms from the society to control it. And I think this is very important. Again, as you mentioned also, when we look at what happens in Belarus now, it is very important to see how far the state goes and went actually in the very first days of the protests. But also we had this sad joke from our friends from Belarus who asked at some point, imagine if Lukashenko actually imposed lockdown measures on Belarus. And now he could just say, you know, we're under lockdown, so no one should be visible on the streets because we have COVID-19, not because I want to stay in power. So to what extent can we allow the state to use and abuse this COVID-19 rhetoric, even if we don't really understand the scientific underpinnings of it, is a highly debated question, and I would like to see it being debated further.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Estela, you have the final word.
Yes, well, I can't be original. I can actually only subscribe to much of what has been said, both in terms of Altynay's maybe skepticism towards thinking that this new role of the state may actually mean a new configuration of neoliberalism. Yes, of course, I didn't mean also to be naive in terms of what this new protagonism of the state may mean, but I would want to think that a window of opportunity is open, taking up on Katerina's word, of whether we are seeing a new opportunity for transformation. And Maksym also already talked about this new awareness. Solidarity was another word that was mentioned by the two other panelists. So I think there is this sort of awareness about the common, about this common responsibility towards each other that's becoming physical. The extent to which we are really now co-responsible of the spread of the pandemic. There was at the very beginning of the pandemic, many intellectuals, many public intellectuals and scholars wrote and published about this, and one of the most prominent voices was that of Zizek, of Zizek, saying, yes, this could be the end of capitalism, and I would agree with seeing that more, being more cautious about that. But maybe I would like to point out to an action initiated online by Bruno Latour, who online published like a series of questions and invited to answer them individually and sharing them also with others. The first one, what are the activities now suspended that you would like to see not resumed? And what is harmful or superfluous or dangerous about that? And how could we make it better or more consistent? What measures may no longer be able maybe to continue, and what activities now suspended we would like actually to develop or to resume or even create from scratch. I'm happy also to share this link, but what I wanted to mean is it is an opportunity to rethink about how we used to live, what we want to keep about that and what not. And in this point, I can only give the question back to Katerina and the rest of the participants who are in a stage of their lives with maybe much more possibilities for imagining and creating something new. Yes, it is an opportunity, but we have to be very cautious about what that may mean. I wouldn't be, also too mystic, too bright about that.
Yes, thank you. We've just got one philosophically sounding question, which sums up perhaps parts of the discussion, but we can also interpret it in different ways. I just want to read it out. It says here, the new normal means the future normal, question mark. But I think that would be kind of the opening to another bigger discussion. So I'd like to thank you, Estela, Altynay, and Maksym, and also, of course, the Viadrinicum for organizing this panel discussion. I think it's been a very wide-ranging discussion and really showing us the issues we need to think about and do more research on and also become active about. So thank you very much, and I hope we continue the discussion at some point.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Have a great day.
You too.
Bye.